Is this thing on? Welcome back to Big Mouth and fancy seeing you here in June. A very welcome, my friends, and especially my enemies. Come in, sit down, no touching. I don't do the touching. Are you feeling charitable? Then smash the subscribe button and the like button, and please do follow me on Twitter at Movies TV Man. And welcome to Saturday's edition of the huge dceu daily. They're even talking about it in Egypt. I don't know why I'm known in Egypt, but apparently I am. So anyway, on today's dceu daily, we are going back to September 2017 because I want to show you how far this fandom, this movement, with alongside Zack Snyder and Deborah Snyder, how far we've come and how things have changed and what is the difference of mentality now. So, as I say, an article stuck in my mind from September 2017 when Vulture had an exclusive interview with Diane Nelson and Jeff Johns. Now, at the time, we allowed this to escape us, right? It was like everything was going to be, they were talking about the garden being rosy now, and it was bad before, but now, ever since Wonder Woman, everything's all right. And there's going to be a change of mentality at DC Entertainment, and this was the whole framework. Now, I remember reading this and kind of getting excited because even though even back then I loved Zack's movies, there was I was really kind of weighed down by the negativity. So I thought if we can at least make these movies successful and talked about and loved, maybe that would be good. Of course, we love Zack's DCEU movies, but the mainstream have always had an issue with them. So cast your minds back to 2017. The marketing for the Justice League movie begins, and here's a big interview back in September 2017. So, DC rethinks its universe. That's the title of this interview by Abraham Reisman. While DC Entertainment has won big in comics, TV, and games, they've struggled at the movies. Does Wonder Woman know the way forward? Now, that struggling thing, we will get back to that after I've read this article. There's a paradox of DC Entertainment, and it can be summed up by looking at two men who wear Superman's tights. One of them is Tyler Hoechlin, a dreamy American who portrays the Man of Steel on the small screen as part of the TV show Supergirl. The other is Henry Cavill, a statuesque Brit who plays him in DC's big screen outings like Man of Steel and Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice. In this fall's mega tentpole Justice League, Hoechlin's Superman has a sterling image among the public. He's not a series regular, but when he does show up, fans go gaga for him. I am not going to comment on that at all. Much as they salivate over the well-reviewed show, in general, Cavill's Supes, on the other hand, has an image control problem. All of his movies so far have been met with at least a certain amount of critical disdain, if not outright derision. In short, one Superman is flying high, and the other is experiencing turbulence. Right, I think what I do need to talk about Tyler Hoechlin's Superman. When he first came in, I loved him. I think he's good at what he does. He plays him well. He's upstanding, he's polite, he's heroic. I like Tyler. I have nothing personally against Tyler, but of course we forget about the time where he was in his Superman costume and he gave us all the finger as a joke. That was very controversial. I didn't mind myself, but people were very offended by that. And also his height's been an issue as well. He's shorter than the actor who plays James Olsen. Right, I don't know if he's still on that show, by the way, and the guy who plays James Olsen. But yeah, so basically fans did have issues with that. So it's not the whole thing of he's amazing and nobody likes Henry Cavill. But of course, this journalist has been primed to kind of convince us to move away from Zack and the new vision at DC Entertainment. So I'll continue. It's DC Entertainment in a microcosm. When it comes to movies, there's a chronic bad buzz. Elsewhere, things are going swimmingly. Once known as DC Comics, a 2009 restructuring made the Warner Brothers' own company more than just a comics publisher. They now also work in a coalition with the rest of Warner to produce superhero content. In TV, games, consumer products, and films, their comics are in a sales renaissance. thanks to recent initiative called Rebirth. Yeah, Rebirth was very, very successful. DC TV shows like Gotham, Arrow, and The Flash enjoy meaty ratings and fan loyalty. DC video games like the Injustice and Batman Arkham franchises are considered some of the best that the medium has to offer, correct? Hell, even a partnership with Warner's consumer products division is bearing fruit. The DC Superhero Girls toy line has turned into a miniature empire, complete with animated web cartoons and a New York Times best-selling book. Wow! You need to go back and look at the sales of those toys. And by the way, I love DC Superhero Girls. I was watching it on Netflix this morning, but that is an outright lie about the sales of the toys. Anyway, so what accounts for the contrasting reputations? Perhaps part of the problem is that the movies until recently had very little influence from the core DC Entertainment team, who, now this is when it became movies by committee, you see. You can see how they're rebranding it. They're not saying it how it actually is. But never mind, who had done so well elsewhere? It took some work for us to earn our stripes, I think, with the rest of the studio and filmmakers, says the company's boyish chief creative officer, Jeff Johns. Here we go. Sitting at a long table alongside a clutch of DC executives in a San Diego Marriott on the first day of this July's San Diego Comic-Con. But in the past 16 months, they've gained significantly more influence on the movie operation. Do you see where we're going with this? And that change is already bearing fruit. It's not chaos. DC Entertainment President Diane Nelson assures me, seated near Johns, it's intentional. Where is Diane Nelson now? Where is she? She's so good at her job, she hasn't got her job anymore, has she? Anyway, Diane Nelson, I've got respect for you. I think you're a good lady, but at the end of the day, you got involved in something I think you heavily regret, and it was the betrayal of Zack's vision. But anyway, they're in the midst of a fight to convince the public that that's the case. For years, they've struggled at the multiplex, while their blood rival Marvel soared starting in 2008. Marvel pioneered a Hollywood buzz concept known as the cinematic universe, a narrative enterprise in which a bunch of individual films are said to exist in the same world, with characters crossing over lots of build-up to mega movies where the whole gang gets together. Disney-owned Marvel has captured billions of eyes and dollars by running that operation with an iron fist. Its movies are all tightly linked, and its brand image is held in a vice grip. Seeing the success of that model, Warner launched its own shared filmy cosmology with 2013's Man of Steel, which did well at the box office but received criticism for its depiction of a brooding Superman who murders someone at the end of the story. He doesn't murder someone. It's called manslaughter. It's called self-defense. But you keep on going. So, someone at the end of the story. Then came 2016's grim, gritty, costly Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, which drew a harsh critical response and with a global gross of $873 million, fell far short of Marvel's $1.53 billion earner that year, Captain America Civil War. Again, we're going to go through this after this article. Mainly, I just want to show you how far we've come. Just a few months later, Suicide Squad earned $745 million, a hefty chunk of change that was savaged by critics, leaving it with 25% critical aggregate on Rotten Tomatoes. Those speed bumps would be bad enough, but the fact that these DC movies are all part of one interlinked super story made the situation all the more problematic. Excuse me? How can you have a successful universe if its individual galaxies aren't doing so hot? Again, we are going to cover that after this article. None of that seems to worry Nelson, and that's partly because DC and Warner have adopted a new strategy. Here we go. Let's rethink that whole universe thing. They're not giving up on the idea of continuity, but they want to de-emphasize the idea that all of these flicks are occupying the same space. Our intention, certainly moving forward, is using the continuity to help make sure nothing is diverging in a way that doesn't make sense. But there's no insistence upon an overall storyline or an interconnectivity in that universe. Now, why would you want to do that, right? That would only excite fans and bring more people to the table. But yeah, don't worry, Diane, says Nelson, drawing nods from the top brass around her. The new approach already has a test case, and by any measure it was a successful one. Wonder Woman out-earned every other movie this summer while scoring 92% on Rotten Tomatoes, higher than nearly every Marvel movie, and one of the keys, as Nelson and her exec saw it, was the fact that it more or less told the viewer to ignore the rest of the universe. Wow! Wow, even though at the beginning of the film it's blatantly obvious they're continuing with the friendship of Bruce Wayne and Diana, right? Because he's blimmin' sent her that bloody picture, right? So nothing to do with the rest of the universe. Anyway, you keep on hanging yourself there, Diane. Right. Where are we? Yeah, told the viewer to ignore the rest of the universe. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? Oh, because you were embarrassed of it. Right, anyway, and just focus on what was in front of them. There was a tiny nod to Batman v Superman. Here we go. That was it. The movie's not about another movie, says John. Some of the movies do connect the characters together like Justice League. But like with Aquaman, one of their next efforts out in 2018, our goal is not to connect Aquaman to every movie. As Nelson puts it, moving forward, you'll see the DC movie universe being a universe, but one that comes from the heart of the filmmaker who's creating them. Zack Snyder's Justice League came from his heart. You abolished it. Batman v Superman, the theatrical cut, wasn't Zack Snyder's art, but that's what you wanted to put out, right? So you're contradicting yourself already anyway. One of the centerpieces of this new decentralized strategy is an as yet unnamed side label of occasional movies that are completely separate from everything else. In other words, the DC Black Label. So even then they were looking at that. Set entirely outside of the cinematic universe, total standalones based on good ideas from big-name filmmaker movies that are just movies, not components of a larger piece of clockwork. The first one they're talking about is a solo outing about supervillain the Joker, said to be directed and co-written by The Hangover and War Dogs alums Todd Phillips. War Dogs alums Todd Phillips. Just Todd Phillips. So why are you pluralising it? Anyway, John says they'll be announcing the name of the side label soonish. Now, this is interesting because they never did that. They decided not to do that because they weren't confident the Joker was going to be a hit. So now they can do that. But still, that hasn't happened, right? So this is interesting, whether we'll get another Joker or another standalone. Interesting what's happening with that sideline. Of course, things are changing all the time. Things are changing now that AT&T are involved. So we'll see what happens. I do want to see those standalone movies continue, by the way. That all may be welcome news for critics who felt that the previous DC outings were too tied up in the world building, but it won't be single-handedly clobber the pessimistic chatter Warner Brothers superheroes face while DC Entertainment has experienced tremendous success in TV, comics and games. When it comes to film, they still have a huge issue with public perception, but they think they're turning a corner. The approach Warner and DC are now implementing at the Cineplex is not the one they came to easily, nor is it one they hammered out solely as a reaction to movie backlash. It arrived after nearly a decade of growth, missteps and careful corporate manoeuvring. If the story of DC Entertainment's rise were a comic book, it might be one of those comics starring an unlikely pairing of mismatched protagonists. Call them Geek Lad and Executive Woman. Johns is very inch and uber nerd, having read comics his entire life and practically memorized whole reams of them. Nelson had hardly ever lifted a comic book prior to getting a current job. John is internally in the public eye, cheerily giving interviews to even the filmiest geek blogs to tell the company line. Nelson rarely talks to journalists and mostly operates in the background. Johns built a career as a DC Comics writer after getting his first gig there in 1999. Nelson navigated Warner's C-suite and distinguished herself by managing the company's Harry Potter brand. But in the pivotal year of 2009, they were brought together to face a common foe, the threat posed to Warner by Marvel. But isn't it interesting? If they actually did a good job with Superman Returns and Nolan's movies were interconnected with Returns, right? And the Green Lantern film starring Ryan Reynolds, they would have had a universe before Marvel, right? right? You see? So the company was dumb. The company's been dumb for many, many years. Up until that point, Batman had brought great treasure to Warner, most recently in the form of Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins and billion-dollar earner The Dark Knight. But a challenger was emerging with a new strategy. Marvel Entertainment had started making its own movies, in the first two, 2008 sensational Iron Man and that same summer's lesser hit The Incredible Hulk, had drawn attention for being set in the same world and promising future installments in that shared franchise. They'd even been successful despite starring B-tier superheroes. Warner was making good movies, but Marvel seemed to represent the world to come. So this writer's admitted that they were making good movies. Obviously, not talking about Zack's, talking about Nolan stuff, right? Anyway, DC was so far behind the 8 ball of Marvel in terms of the entertainment side, says a former DC editor. They needed to get their shit together. And Warner Brothers needed to get their shit together in terms of the film stuff. Warner Brothers Entertainment Chairman, CEO Barry Meyer, President, CEO Alan Horn, and Alan Horn and Warner Movies chief Jeff Robinoff convened and decided to emphasize, hang on, Alan Horn, isn't he at Disney now? Oh my God. It's all making sense now, right? So basically, he was one of the people who betrayed Zack, then he went off to Disney. Well, isn't it funny what you learn when you reread something? Anyway, Alan Horn and Warner Movies chief Jeff Robinoff convened and decided to emphasize DC as a bulwark against the rise of Marvel. That meant an end to DC Comics and the birth of the reinvented organization, DC Entertainment, with the mandate to get DC intellectual property aggressively placed in more parts of Warner's operations, and to push out superhero products in as many mediums as possible. There were few precedents to such an initiative, except for what they'd done with Harry Potter. In fact, you didn't do with anything with Harry Potter, Warner Brothers. Basically, it was J.K. Rowling who made all the big decisions. Luckily for you, backed her up, or she was going to take her brand away. But if it wasn't for her, they wouldn't have been a success. So you shouldn't have even been patting yourselves on the back over that. When it came time to pick a leader, the choice was natural. Robinoff asked Nelson to take the job, and after she accepted, DC Entertainment was announced on September the 9th, 2009. Nelson knew DC would retain its near total control over what it did with comics, and to handle that task, she selected creator-editor Jim Lee, great choice, and executive Dan Didio to act as co-publishers. Their first order of business was getting their comics back on track. After years of slumping sales, and they did so with an unprecedented effort called the New 52. Now, this is interesting, because the New 52 is a controversial kind of story kind of timeline. I like the New 52, but there's a lot of people that hated it. I think more people appreciate it more now, but it wasn't, and it did sell. It did sell at first, I think, but they got rid of that as well in the end, didn't they? They cancelled all their existing superhero comics and replaced them with 52 new ones, all set in a tightly controlled new universe, not unlike the one that would later be experimented with in film. It was a smash and shot them ahead of Marvel in sales. Nelson and her team didn't have and would never have that kind of direct influence over any of the other mediums in which their superheroes appeared. When it came to all other divisions, Nelson would have to play nice. That meant a need for a new role, one whose borders would be blurry and whose responsibilities would be multitudinous. A chief creative officer who would act as a liaison to the rest of Warner's. Right, I want to stop there for a minute and explain to you what John's position was. Jeff Johns wasn't actually Kevin Feige, as we thought when he was given that job. This is a guy who works in the front line, but ultimately is the agent of the company, of the suits, of the shareholders. That means if they wanted to take direct action in what was going on the set, he could interfere. Jeff Johns had betrayed not only Zack Snyder, but everything that he stood for and everything that his mentor, Richard Donner, stands for. Right? So where are we? Johns was DC's golden boy at the time, penning hit stories about the company's biggest characters and stoking interest in many of their lesser-known ones too. What's more, he had Hollywood experience before working at DC. He'd been an intern and a production assistant for production house Donner's company. After a series of conversations, Nelson concluded that she'd found in Johns a perfect candidate and anointed him as a CCO. And I basically explained to you, he wasn't Kevin Feige. He wasn't just independently running the DCEU. He was, in fact, he was like the paper boy for the suits. So he wasn't helping the situation, right? It's basically a position that doesn't help because Kevin Feige is independent of Disney. Marvel Studios, they do their thing and then they take it back to them and they, obviously they have to look over it. But there's independence there. There's a freedom of creativity because Feige's proven himself, of course, as well. Anyway, together they've inherited a mixed bag of existing multimedia projects. Some were exciting visions of the future, most notably video game Batman Arkham Asylum had just drawn prey for its innovative gameplay. On the other hand, there were unpromising movies in the pipeline, a film adaptation of the lesser-known DC comic character Jonah Hex starring Josh Brolin, which would have been amazing. DC Comics character Jonah Hex starring Josh Brolin. Film adaptation of a lesser-known DC Comics character Jonah Hex starring Josh Brolin. They did a joke, Jonah Hex. Was Josh Brolin in that one, or is this another one they're talking? Anyway, I'm getting confused. Bombed. Another about a violent anti-hero, Lobo, was announced, but then never materialised. A Lobo movie would have been amazing. Imagine Zack Snyder developing a Lobo movie. Wow. Oddly and frustratingly, the one project that ended up being Warner's biggest DC comic-based effort was the one Johns and Nelson had the least access to. Here we go. The nascent DC Cinematic Universe in August 2008. Just after the release of The Dark Knight, Warner opted to do a new take on Superman. Romanoff turned to Christopher Nolan, who has successfully reinvigorated the Batman franchise, for advice on how to move forward. Nolan suggested two potential helmets, Black Swans, Darren Aronofsky, and 300, Zack Snyder. The studio moved ahead with Snyder, who was in a way the least likely choice of the two, given that he had just directed 2009's DC adaptation Watchmen and received mixed reviews and mediocre ticket sales. Nevertheless, the process of making Man of Steel began. Watchmen got its ticket sales. It's because Watchmen was a less, fanboys and girls love Watchmen, but it wasn't a big thing. It was never going to make big money. Watchmen is an amazing movie and an amazing achievement by Zack Snyder, but you're never going to hear those people say that. Around the same time, a film initiative that took much of nascent DC Entertainment's attention was 2011's movie about John's beloved Green Lantern, which Jeff Johns was heavily involved in, don't forget that, which had been in development long before DC reorganised. Ryan Reynolds was the star, Blake Lively was the female lead, and Warner had plans to build it out with at least one sequel. DC wasn't closely involved in the film's development. Oh, right, of course you weren't. In other words, you're blaming other people, but Johns was a consultant and a cheerleader and director Martin Campbell recalls meeting with him to talk about the ins and outs of the character. DC offered support where they could. Johns' office coordinated with others at Warner to help create Green Lantern animated movie and a Green Lantern CGI kids cartoon. Expectations were steep. In fact, the animated series was amazing. I will give them that. So was The Fall. Released in June of 2011, Green Lantern barely made back its budget and earned 27% on Rotten Tomatoes. Obviously, the film was a failure. Campbell recalls bluntly, it comes out and everybody feels depressed, and so on and so forth. There's no point in bullshitting about it. Critics and viewers rallied against the childishly light sense of humour and incoherent climax, as well as the kitschy, cartoonish effects. I loved the film. Shut up. Plans for the sequels were abruptly cancelled, just like that Warner's big plan for the new DC eluded hero was dashed, and an embarrassment was made of the first major attempt at a cross-platform branding in the DC Entertainment era. Now listen to me, right? Green Lantern had issues, and the effects was one of them, but the actual film is pretty good and pretty cohesive, if you ask me. And any issues they could have sorted out in the sequel. The movie made $200 million, right? It wasn't a lot of money, but they could have done better. But Warner Brothers back then were too reactive to bloggers and critics and journalists. They were literally on the floor begging for mercy. And this is not the way you run companies. You make a mistake, you do better the next time. And this was the big problem. So looking back, it's really interesting. Nelson and Johns faced further cinematic frustration during the development of Man of Steel. Here we go. They were marginalised creatively. It was a decidedly gritty take on Superman, and its final battle featured him remorselessly destroying the skyscrapers. Remorselessly destroying the skyscrapers. He didn't stand there bashing the skyscrapers, right? He was fighting a superpowered alien. He wasn't thinking about what was going to fall down. It was a realistic, gritty fight. Oh, pathetic. Anyway, and ultimately executing his foe, General Zod. This didn't sit right with Johns. Here we go. Jeff Johns and Diane were reading scripts, and Jeff Johns, to his credit, was concerned that there was not enough lightness or humour given who the character is, recalls one person with knowledge of the making of Man of Steel. Jeff definitely raised that point, but that current administration didn't care that much about what Jeff Johns thought. Here we go, you see, and this is where the fans got this betrayal from, right? The movie came out in June 2013 with the DC Entertainment branding, but largely without its fingerprints. They had no control over it, and they wasn't happy. It's not the movie they wanted to make. So we look at Warner Brothers back then. They had a civil war. So you've got DC Entertainment, who are trying to get hold of this movie to have some kind of influence on it. You've got Christopher Nolan, who's literally an executive producer, and he pretty much said, Zack Snyder's running this, you're nothing to do with it, I'm standing by the gate, sorry Jeff, you're not coming in. That was the situation, and there was a frustration there. But here's the problem. If you're going to have a DC Entertainment branding, you either have them running the films, or you don't. Or you just say they're involved in that. But then you have a problem. Then you have a problem because, you know, a creative has been brought in that DC Entertainment don't believe in. So already you've got one side plotting against the other side. So the actual studio created the problem to begin with. We go on. It also had the seeds of a larger Marvel-style expanded world. A few weeks after its release in 2013 San Diego Comic-Con, Warner announced a sequel that would pit Batman and Superman against each other. And it was made clear in the announcement that the film would draw on the famously dark 86 comic, The Dark Knight Returns. John's warning about needing lightness were going unheeded. Oh dear. A new Warner CEO, Kevin Sugihara, was coronated that year. So remember, 2013 is when Sugihara came in. This is important for the timeline we're putting together. I like to deal in facts, right? And he was much more bullish on superheroes than his predecessor had been. Under his watch, the studio rolled out in October 2014 an ambitious slate of 10 DC-based movies stretching to 2020. They were all to be part of the same grand cinematic universe. It was more than a little insane, given that the cinematic universe at that point only consisted of Man of Steel, which hadn't been received with wild enthusiasm, but it was too late for second thoughts. Warner was all in on DC properties, if not always on DC advice. Right, Sugihara launched this slate. So there must have been at some point by Sugihara some belief in Zack's vision. That's interesting. So you can kind of see now what was happening. I would predict that Jeff Johns and Diane Nelson were going back to Sugihara and saying, look, this guy's ruining things. We've got to get rid of this guy. I think that's what was going on. So largely shut out from the big screen, Johns and Nelson focused on the small. There they found salvation in the form of the embittered veteran of Green Lantern screenwriter and TV showrunner Greg Berlanti of Dawson's Creek and Everwood fame, and co-written. The initial passes at the Lantern script had been set to direct before he was reassigned to another Warner feature and lost control. He was understandably displeased with the finished product and nearly walked away from Warner for good. Of course he did. In a last-ditch effort to hold on to him, Johns, as well as TV execs Peter Roth and Susan Rovner, reached out to Berlanti and encouraged him to pitch a blue sky idea, lifelong DC Comics geek. Berlanti said he had been kicking around the notion of adapting the archery-themed Crusader, Green Arrow. Now, before you give Greg Berlanti this big credit, well, he did do Arrow. Green Arrow was only known in the mainstream because Smallville had introduced the character via Justin Hartley in its 6th season. I'm a big Smallville fan. Without the interpretation of Green Arrow on Smallville, this show would never have worked, no matter how good it was, right? And I admit, the first 2 seasons of Arrow were amazing, but then they dumbed down. In other words, since season 2 of The Flash and Arrow, all we've had is the same mess that Jeff Johns and Diane Nelson brought to Justice League 2017. So we go on. So they brought their friend Berlanti, who's pretty much got 200 shows everywhere now. And we know the type of shows he likes to make. So if you watch Arrowverse, this is what they wanted to do to the DCEU. Is that what you want? Is that do you watch Arrowverse and think, oh, I'd love the DCEU movie universe to be like that? No, I didn't think so. So now I'm starting to get perspective, and I'll tell you why. He got the go-ahead, and he co-produced. Mark Guggenheim and Andrew Kreisberg got the hammer out and went on to become the CW's Arrow. They would get near total creative freedom, and there was no talk of tying into the DC Films universe. You see, at the start of this article, you notice how they talk about how good Arrowverse is, because Johns was connected to it. Do you understand how they work? And this was to feed you, the public, into their way of thinking. Smart. The show debuted on the CW on October 10th, 2012, and within days it had a full series order. Johns didn't just advise creatively, he also wrote episodes for it and eventually started scheming with Berlanti and Kreisberg to create a spin-off series about DC's staple, The Flash. It debuted on October the 7th, 2014, and represented Johns' biggest involvement in TV yet. And a so-called Berlantiverse started to emerge in the next few years. And with 2 more shows set in the same shared Cosmos, Supergirl and DC's Legends of Tomorrow, the shows have earned booming praise from fans built on a guiding philosophy of, as Berlanti Productions president Sarah Sheetsha puts it, heart, humour and spectacle. It's working. Berlantiverse shows regularly top the ratings charts at the CW. It's working for a little girls channel, right? But you can't. Let's say that again. Heart, humour and spectacle, but no depth. No depth. That's what they wanted to do to the DCEU. I'll repeat, that's what they wanted to do to the DCEU. This was their big grand plan. Now, to a point, it's still working, and good luck to them. It's good for the kids, it's good for young girls, and I'm happy they're doing it and it's successful. But just because they're doing it there and it's successful on the Little Girls Network, it doesn't mean it's going to work over there. Now, when you talk about the MCU, it's not like the Arrowverse. It's not. There is some depth in some of the movies. It does work. They have developed the characters. It's not what we want to see over at DC, but for them, it works. And it's certainly not Arrowverse. Let's get that straight as well. DC's developed a winning strategy. Now, the whole idea, right, of telling us all this is saying that, yeah, we can do it for the films as well. You see, it's a good idea. That what they're doing, they're giving you their CV. They're trying to convince you that what you're seeing in Zack's movies is not very good and we should bin it, right? They were trampling on Zack's corpse and they didn't want you to see what was going on. DC developed a winning strategy on TV, one that presaged the current one for the movies, you see, allowing people to throw a wide variety of approaches at the wall and see what sticks. For example, the Berlanti-produced programs have a shared universe, but Gotham, iZombie, Lucifer and the upcoming Titans all stand on their own and have widely different tones from one another. Creators are trusted to make their own decisions about direction and feel, and John's team is seen as a trusted set of partners offering suggestions and constructive criticism, and not a draconian office forcing everything to fit into a single shared mega story. Should I repeat what they just called Zack? Draconian. Draconian. That's what they were doing. So this journalist was definitely, this journalist basically was one of them, and this was out. This was to create something. This was set to create propaganda against Zack and for Jeff. Now, I didn't see this at the time. And you lot have been saying to me for ages, right? We'll talk about it in a minute. Because I've got to admit I'm wrong here. Or I was. Slumping New 52 sales led to DC to adopt the creator-first tactic in comics. As well, in May of 2016, they launched an initiative called Rebirth, in which the tight continuity was eschewed in favour of whatever good ideas the comics creators had. The Flash comic writers Joshua Williamson recalls worrying about violating New 52 continuity. But it didn't bother you when you brought the New 52 and got rid of the past things, right, though? Right? Anyway, during a Rebirth brainstorming session with John, but Jeff was like, just forget everything. None of that matters. None of it matters. What are you trying to say about this character? Rebirth was an instant hit. And when it launched on May 25th, 2016, and it continues to be one, but a week before Rebirth debuted, the bombs were dropped. Johns had flown to New York to talk to reporters about the comics initiative, but he found himself mobbed by questions about wholly unrelated to the funny books. Reports had emerged overnight that Johns was no longer just a creative liaison to the rest of Warner Brothers, that he'd been paired with studio exec John Berg to oversee Warner's superhero movie output. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. The recent critical failure of Batman v Superman had spooked the powers that be, and a change in the leadership structure was necessary. Having found success in TV and comics, the experts at DC Entertainment were being called in alongside Berg to bring their skills to a new arena. Johns and his boss Nelson had just adopted a problem child. Wow. So right, at this moment when John Berg comes in, this is when they're scheming to betray Zack, to boot him out, right? And do some cartoony 1 hour and 58 minutes Justice League, right? Ultimately, Jeff Johns is still working with DC. He's obviously doing the Green Lantern. He's still got a job. And he's working with, what's her name? The director of Wonder Woman, Patty Jenkins. How could I forget that wonderful name, right? He co-wrote the Wonder Woman 1984 movie, and they're doing a spin-off as well. So he's involved, right? But he's not involved as a leader anymore, right? So basically, Jeff is a big DC fan and he wanted his hands on the shared universe to do as he pleased. But unfortunately, Jeff wasn't his own boss. And ultimately, I'm sure if Jeff could go back, he would have convinced them to bin Snyder, yes, but not to bring in Joss Whedon just like that to continue to kind of finish off a movie on the same schedule, but to bin everything and just start from fresh, the whole thing from fresh, right? That's what they would have wanted to do. Totally reboot the DCEU, right? And forget about what Zack had done. Maybe that could have worked. And then Diane Nelson, John Berg and Jeff Johns would still be running DC Entertainment. But unfortunately, the studio run by Kevin Sugihara, and who knows what he was thinking at the time, decided that it was time for Zack to go. They forced him to rewrite his Justice League script twice already. So we saw what was going on. We just refused to see it, right? The DC Cinematic Universe made a splash 2 months prior to Rebirth with the DC Cinematic Universe made a splash 2 months prior to Rebirth with the troubled March 2016 release of Snyder-directed Batman v Superman, which had, like its predecessor, kept Johns and DC at arm's length. Creatively, the similarity gritty Suicide Squad was in the middle of its own difficult post-production at the same time. You know why it was in a difficult post-production? Because you wouldn't let David Ayer make his movie. You took it from him and you reshot elements without him. I'm convinced of that. Reportedly going through massive redits to make it closer to the tone of the early trailer. When BVS flopped critically, there was finally concern about the creative choices that had been made up to that point. Johns and Berg, newly installed, swiftly decided that a core element of their new strategy would be a lightening of the previously sludge-dark mood. All of a sudden, you saw Johns doing interviews where he'd talk about how the DC mythology is built on hope and optimism. Berg was on the same page. We talk about 4 things, Berg says: heart, heroics, humanity, and humour. Already, they're going down a direction that's going to be their ending, right? Already, I remember one time when someone said to him, you know, the characters are darker at DC, a bit different. He goes, no, they are very optimistic. And I remember him saying that and thinking, well, that's not a bad thing to say, but then we didn't really realise what was going on behind the scenes, did we? There was one place where they could swiftly implement that approach. Patty Jenkins directed Wonder Woman. Slated for release the following summer, though he wasn't credited as a writer in the finished product. Johns assisted writer Alan Heinberg with the script, and he grew close with Jenkins. The result of their partnership was the most all-round successful DC Cinematic Universe movie to date. As for now, it's accumulated more than $410 million domestically, a bigger domestic gross than any Warner Bros. Movie in the history other than two of the Nolan Batmans. Not only that, but it was the highest grossing live-action film ever directed by a woman, and was held by its proponents as a kind of feminist landmark for the first time in history. Wonder Woman is more of a crown jewel for the DC brand than Superman or Batman. Wow! She's more of a crown jewel than Superman or Batman, and Wonder Woman 2617 is a feminist movie. No, it's not a feminist movie. It's being accepting of everyone, about standing up from your comfort zone, sitting there with this group of men you've never met before and listening to their fears and their hopes. That's what Wonder Woman does in that movie. As Patty Gal always said, it's for everyone. But these people will translate anything they want. And by the way, before we go on, Wonder Woman it's a hopeful movie. There's optimism in it, but there's also a lot of darkness. And there's a couple of gags, but I wouldn't call it overly hilariously funny either. I think this film is more in the tone of BVS, A Man of Steel, than it is of Iron Man, but there you go. That's just me. However, there's still a spandex-clad elephant in the room. This November's Justice League. Its optics haven't been great right after BVS Backlash hit. The fact that Snyder would also be in charge of Justice League cast a pall over the latter effort among the movie. To commemorate trial. There was internal discussions about how to revamp parts of the movie. Johns and Berg mould the idea of having someone other than Snyder write new scenes for the film. By coincidence, the writer-director of Marvel's The Avengers, Joss Whedon, met with Johns and Berg to discuss creating a movie with them. The pair were game for that. They eventually chose one about Batman ally Batgirl, but later realised they would accomplish another goal. Everyone was excited about Joss being a part of DC, and we thought he'd be great to write the Justice League scenes, the additional photography scenes that we wanted to get, John recalls. Imagine it, right? They've got rid of Zack. They kind of stepped over that, by the way. They got rid of Zack. Of course, this family tragedy kind of justification, but it was nothing to do with that. They stabbed him in the back, got rid of him, and then brought in Joss Whedon. And Joss Whedon was going to save the DCEU. He was going to make it fun and more loving and more optimistic. How do you release a film like they did and think that was an improvement to Suicide Squad and BVS and Man of Steel? But these were the people who didn't like what Zack was doing. So just to have a bit of a lighter tone and to bend the knee to the critics and the bloggers, they put up an absolute mess for the public to see. That choice took on added importance when tragedy hit Justice League soon afterwards. Snyder's daughter died by suicide in March of this year. The director remained attached to the film for a few months, but on May the 22nd he announced he would be departing to grieve, leaving the remainder of the film to Whedon. Since then rumours about the picture have come out in dribs and drabs. Whedon has allegedly rewritten a third of the film, including the ending. The Justice League sequel that was announced in 2014 was very notably not mentioned at a Comic-Con presentation, compounding speculation that it's not going to happen. There are reports of an expensive, difficult to coordinate last-minute reshoots, and so DC and Warners don't comment on these rumours, but it hasn't added up to a great image for the mecha tentpole. So already Zack's been stabbed in the back. They made him lie about why he was leaving. So John's got his hands on Justice League and the future of the DCEU, at least temporarily. His mission had been accomplished. In general image, control appears to be one of the biggest challenges facing DC movie enterprises today. If they're getting their house in order or out of order behind the scenes, that public rarely sees that. News about hiring or development deals come from the unofficial channels, and they are often portrayed as being the product of a studio that's just trying things without any coherent mission. One minute the director at the next standalone Batman movie, Matt Reeves, will suggest the flick isn't set in the cinematic universe. The next day he'll say it's of course part of that universe. There was once talk of a Suicide Squad spin-off called Gotham City Sirens. There was a report that another movie would supersede it. Then there was a report that Sirens was still on. But you know why there was no cohesion? Because they wouldn't let Zack do what he wanted to do. Because they never wanted Zack at DC Entertainment. Because Warner Brothers had gone to Christopher Nolan and he went, no, I'm not getting involved with this. I want to do my other movies. I'll bring someone who I believe can do something special. From Nolan's eyes, Zack would do something special because they're kind of chiseled from the same cloth, right? But to DC Entertainment, he is the prosthesis of dark, uninspirational storytelling. But of course, that's not the story Zack was attempting to tell. Anyway, when I asked Johns about the criticism that it seems like there's no strategy, he shows a rare break from his usual buoyancy. Some of the stuff is true, some of it isn't true, he says. When we talk about things or we're making deals for people to develop scripts or whatever, sometimes things leak. Sometimes they are misreported and it's frustrating because we do want to go out there and talk about what our strategy is, and this stuff just muddies the water. There's a lot of eternal conversations going on about how do we help kind of clean that up a bit. So don't forget, right, back then, when this internal struggle was going on between Zack and DC Entertainment, things would leak out. There wasn't any official announcements. You remember when Feige used to stand on the stage and tell you what's next? Not these people. It was an absolute mess because there was absolutely no leadership and too many people were pulling in too many different directions. Still, there's little sign that DC's first post-Justice League feature, next year's James Wan-directed Aquaman, has been troubled in any significant way. So even if League doesn't flow quite right, Warner hopes to come out well with the next installment. Plus, Nelson says to just look at the movies is to miss the overall forward motion that DC Entertainment has been experiencing in its past few short years. Films are massively important, but they're not everything, she says. Oh, how convenient she's saying that. They already knew that Justice League was going to be crap, right? We want to make sure these stories and characters are working everywhere, and they have. I think in a pretty unprecedented way, she says. In more than a few ways, she's not wrong. The stories and characters that are working extremely well in comics, games and TV, and the first movie DC Entertainment had substantial influence on, Wonder Woman, certainly worked. So all of a sudden, they're giving themselves credit for Wonder Woman. Funny, isn't it? Patty did it. But never mind. And by the way, they don't mention the fact that Patty and Zack worked together on that movie. He really did help her with the choreography as well, to make it similar to what we would have already seen. So that's interesting, but they don't mention that. They don't mention the part Zack had to play. Of course not. So where are we? Entertainment has substantial influence on Wonder Woman. Certainly worked. The question now is one of the organisation and momentum. Can they get their public perception sorted out and convince more consumers that they understand what makes the Man of Steel, the Dark Knight and Diana of Themyscira tick? When Johns was out promoting Rebirth, he was asked about what made the DC characters distinctive. His reply encapsulated the challenge his company faces. The iconography and the representation of the ideals they embody means so much to people, he said. There's a lot of emotional underpinning of the characters and the stories, but when it's not there, you really feel the emptiness. And earlier, wow. And that's that. That's the article. So, do you remember that article? Look, we're nearly 50 minutes in. I didn't realise it was that long an article. It doesn't matter, because I'm trying to derive a point here. So that was September 2017. Then, when they were promoting the movie, and I think on the night it premiered, Henry Cavill said this. It might have even been at Comic-Con. Even if there wasn't a Marvel, we would have struggled. I want to repeat what he said. Henry Cavill, the man who played and probably still playing Superman, even without Marvel, we still would have struggled. Do I blame Henry for saying this? No. He was towing the company line. He was the only one they could get to do it, because Gal wasn't going to do it, Jason wasn't going to do it, Ben certainly wasn't going to do it, and Ray definitely wasn't going to do it. These people were loyal to Zack. But the one person, the career actor, who would literally do anything he was told was Henry Cavill. Do I blame him for being an ambitious career actor? No. He didn't have the same loyalty to Zack as the others did. And that's fine. He wants a career and he's getting it. The Witcher has been a massive success for him. Maybe one day he'll play Bond. Who knows if he's still playing Superman. So what do I say to what Cavill said though? Man of Steel made $650 million. Batman v Superman made $875 million. Suicide Squad made nearly $800 million. Wonder Woman made around $800 million. Right? Aquaman made $1 billion. Shazam made about $400 million with a really low budget, which means it made 4 times its own budget. And Todd Phillips' The Joker movie made over $1 billion. There's only one little film that made less than it spent, and that's including Birds of Prey, and that's Justice League. The film that Jeff Johns, John Berg, and Diane Nelson and DC Entertainment were going to hold up and say, yeah, see, Zack, you were wrong, we were right, we're in control now, go away, we're going to do it our way. And guess what happened? It flopped beyond recognition because they were dumb. Is this idea, which they had to lighten things up, a bad business model? Of course not, but you do it when you make your first movie, right? What you don't do is boot out a director, make him lie about the reasons he's leaving, right? Especially seeing the reasons they made him lie about was the death of his daughter, right? Tragic circumstances, right? Horrible, immoral, and wrong. So you don't do that, and then you don't get rid of all his scenes in his movie, right? And bring in another director who takes 30 pieces of silver and agrees to do another movie down the line, pretty much rewrites everything, brings back an actor who's got a moustache, right? There's a refusal to shave it, so they CGI it, and the finished article, because they're in the rush to get to that November the 17th deadline, and the whole film isn't fit for purpose. The effects look terrible. Henry looks terrible. The film is an absolute mess. The backgrounds at the Kent farm were so bad. So bad. They never went back there to film. It was horrible. It broke my heart watching it. How do intelligent people, and let's be clear here, Diane Lane, Diane, I love you, Diane Nelson and Jeff Johns, how do intelligent people like this? Johns is an intelligent man. He started off working for Richard Donner. He got into comics. He's one of the biggest iconic legends in comics, right? He's written some great graphic novels. There's no question about that. His talent as a storyteller is unparalleled. That's not it. He was brought in, and as I say, he wasn't Kevin Feige. We thought that's what he was going to be, but he was a buffer. And the more he got involved with the corporate entity, the more greedy he became. And his love for comics wasn't what it was all about anymore. And this is how he betrayed Zack Snyder. But he betrayed you and me, the DC fans. He betrayed everyone. And you know, when you lot were telling me Jeff Johns is a snake and Jeff Johns is this, I fought you. I defended Jeff. I didn't believe Jeff would do this. And it's only just recently that I realised that you were right. And I'm sorry that I didn't believe you. I just didn't believe my hero, someone I looked up to since I've been a kid, would do this. But he did. You see, everyone's corruptible. So ultimately, we see what happened then, and we read that out, right? Just to show you how far we came. From that in 2017 to where we are now in 2020, Zack bringing back his vision of Justice League after being so betrayed, and maybe more, maybe the reignition of his whole universe, which had depth and had vision, that isn't dull, that isn't dreary, it's compelling, and it's the way I want to see my superhero movies, and I know you do too. We have come such a long way, thanks to you, thanks to me, thanks to hundreds of thousands of people around the world who said, we are not going to allow this to stand. We love Zach's vision. And we stood up in the right way, no matter what the journalists, the bloggers, it doesn't matter what they say anymore. Those were the people, you see, that Johns and Nelson bent the knee for. But this is what I'm trying to tell you. It's all changed now. It's all changed. No one wants to bend the knee to them anymore. Streaming has changed the game. It doesn't matter if they review your movie good, bad, or indifferent. It doesn't matter what Rotten Tomatoes says anymore. It's irrelevant. And seeing that article, one thing was very important to Sujihara and Johns and Nelson, that you could get a good review score, a good Rotten Tomatoes ratio. And even if your movie gets good box office, that's not important. It's the reputation it's got with the press. A ridiculous mentality. But they're gone now. And Zach's back. AT&T buying Warner Brothers and turning it into Warner Media changed everything. It's brought a more professional outlook. They investigated via Ann Sarnoff what happened to Zach. And all you had to do was read that article and see the betrayal of Zack Snyder. Now, I've always said that Warner Brothers' big mistake from the beginning was asking Christopher Nolan to do it, Nolan saying no, but then allowing him to be in charge and tell them who to get to mould the whole project. That's when it went wrong, because you've got DC Entertainment there, you've got Zack there, they both want different things, they're plotting against him, he's fighting to keep his position, and it was uncomfortable. And now it's different. Zack's back, and he has the freedom to do what he wants with the DCEU, the DC Extended Universe, which could be on HBO Max and cinematically, or both. Who knows? AT&T's attitude is different because they know that this guy has a vision and this guy is a genius, and he has a lot of people from the public and the consumer on his side. So, in fact, the faith of the consumer was always there. But it took all of this to happen to convince people, to convince the doubters that Zack was the right man. It's an amazing story. It's a story with a beginning, a middle, and a happy ending for us, the fans, and for Zack Snyder. So I applaud you all. I hope you enjoyed looking back on how Zack was betrayed, how all this started, and how all this ended. Please comment down below. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll be back tomorrow with a much shorter DCEU Daily. See you again soon.